Hey everyone, how's it going? In my previous videos, I've talked about the blast from the past tournament that I will be hosting on the 3rd of March. This will feature classic matchups from previous metas. Using fixed deck lists, players will play these deck lists card for card. They'll know every single card in their deck and their opponent's deck. And it's a very good way to take deck building out of the equation and focus on one's gameplay and how that can be improved. That's what I'm hoping to achieve as one of the goals with this tournament. Today, I will be presenting another one of these fixed matchups. Specifically, we'll be going for the oldest one in the list, Grindel's Supermodernism versus Andysucker from the Honor and Profit meta. That's many years ago. Are you excited for it? I sure am. Let's get into the game. Here are the deck lists for this game. Pause the video if you want to look through them before we begin covering the game. So, as Grindel, I have a lot of priorities and one of them is icing up HQ against Criminal. A very universal thing to do from the core set up to now. This is no exception. With Enigma in my hand, I can keep it. I would much rather see more ice, but with Anonymous Tip, I'm fairly confident I can draw it. Restructuring your opening hand is usually not very good, since you need to click credits to get it to work, but Grindel starts with 10 credits, so you're good to go immediately. Plus, the early hostile hostile takeover allows me to res an archer early on. So, all in all, a pretty decent hand. Against Criminal, your strategy is really to score as quickly as you can before they get the rig set up, because once the rig comes up, you are in a very bad place. Here I'm going to work towards my first objective, which is to create a scoring remote consisting of 2 ice. Ice being an enderun. That way I will be able to protect against inside job and score my agendas. This is the pre-AI meta, so we don't have to worry about cards like Faust. Also, because this is a time where criminals did not really splash medium, we don't really worry so much about an open R&D. You see my opponent not running R&D for 2 reasons. Firstly, they are scared of Sea Scorch, and secondly, even if they do run it, they're not getting much value. Just a credit from Desperado and 1 card of R&D, which could be a snare. So my opponent chooses to set up instead, getting a daily cast on the table and the same old thing, and getting one of their 3 breakers up, the Passport, along with the Corroder. That's 2 of 3. So my opponent is playing it right. They are trying to get all the breakers up, so that they can start hammering. However, the Passport doesn't get through my remote, so clearly my opponent is attempting to attack via HQ instead. So this is a very strong mechanism of pressure that my opponent can place on me, and I do not rest the Enigma here, because it's rather pointless with the bad publicity my opponent has from my ID ability. Making the Enigma not taxing at all, I might as well just concede the credits, and res it only if my opponent decides to come in again with another Siphon. That way I can somewhat dunk the Siphon to some extent. You notice that the Atlas token actually places quite a lot of pressure on my opponent. With no way to get rid of it, I can easily bring up an important card at a crucial time, something like a Scorched Earth. My opponent has to respect the possibility of me having some sort of like a Beanstalk Scorched Earth combo, which would make playing another account Siphon very dangerous in this position. Fortunately for my opponent though, I don't actually have any sort of tag punishment in this deck other than Scorched Earth. So if my opponent simply siphons me to the ground, there's nothing much I can do other than click for 3 credits. So my opponent performs the Siphon here to gain 6 credits, siphoning me of 3, knowing that at 0 credits I can't really threaten anything. But my opponent should stay on at least 4 cards because I can threaten Beanstalk into Scorched Earth. So this is where you really don't want to be as Grindel. On 0 credits, that's very bad. You can't trigger snares, and you can't score agendas, you can't rest ice. So now my objective goes back to clicking for credits. And the good news is I do have Hostile Takeover in my hand. So after 1 turn of clicking for credits, I can potentially burst up and get another agenda point on the table if the Hostile Takeover stays in my hand. Hopefully that happens. For now, I'm clicking for credits. Playing Power Shutdown is an option right here, but I'm really too poor and I really want to score the Hostile Takeover, or at least get in hedge fund range, so I hold off the Power Shutdown. I suspect my opponent will be playing rather aggressively this turn anyway, but nope, they instead clear the tags and then go for a legwork. The last thing I want to see is a legwork, because that means my Hostile Takeover goes to my opponent. Nope, They missed it. 40% chance. Very good for me. I draw yet another hostile takeover. So I'm going to kill the Enigma right here. Reason being, if I score the hostile here, I'm open to another round of siphoning. At 7 credits, I'll be down to 2 credits. I'll be open to legwork as well. Hence, I went for the power shutdown instead to completely remove any form of HQ pressure. But my opponent finds 4 agenda points. This is what happens in the honor and profit meta. No global foods, no NAPDs. You are gonna leak those agendas. Another interesting thing you might have realized is that with my 10 influence, I can't play a lot of cards. In fact, most of my cards are Wayland and neutral. Most notably, I'm running Anonymous Tip instead of Jackson Howard. Even though Jackson Howard was in the card pool by the time these decks were made legal, in Supermodernism, you actually prefer Anonymous Tips over Jackson Howard. This is actually something very important and just shows you how important it is to rush with this deck. Rushing is very crucial because, so crucial in fact that you're willing to sacrifice the power of Jackson Howard and Recursion just so that you can get faster draw with Anonymous Tip. They are both 1 influence cards, but Anonymous Tip makes it in the deck because it's just so much faster to draw past R&D lock. To not being vulnerable to trash on R&D. A lot of factors make Anonymous Tip a slightly better choice. Now that I actually have some sort of money, I'm deciding to bring up an agenda with fast track, even though I have 2 more in hand. Very interesting decision here. I think my thought process here was that I needed to rush out quickly, so the Atlas went to the server and then I played Hedge Fund. This allows me to score the agenda. Given that my opponent only has a Corroder on the table, this means they can't really run R&D. Note that they're on 6 points. Another reason I played the fast track there was to remove an agenda from R&D to make it less palatable for my opponent to go for the win on R&D. This is what you usually do as the runner when you're on match point, but here I'm saying if you don't contest this agenda now, I'm going to get the win pretty soon. My opponent cannot find their breakers, so they run R&D and hit a snare instead. Ooh, huge hit. But it also is a tempo hit for me. Fortunately, again, as you saw, I have the last hostile takeover in my hand, so I can recover with the hostile credits if necessary. Snare didn't hit anything of much note, so my opponent runs again on R&D and then clears tag in case of Scorched Earth. And here I'm just going to score the Atlas, or do I? Think about it a bit. It's pretty clear that my opponent does not have the means to get through my remote. So I do score the Atlas. I could have scored the hostile from my hand instead, but HQ seems secure for now, so I will leave it as it is. One very crucial thing to note right now is that there are 3 hostiles in this deck, and once I score the hostile from my hand, I'll be up on 6 points, but there are no more hostiles left in my deck, which means I have to score at least 1 agenda the normal way in my scoring server. So we have to keep that in mind. Alright. Now that my opponent has spent the turn drawing 3 cards, I'm kind of wary about dropping that false lead in the server. It does look tempting because they might not have drawn their breaker yet, and at the end of the day, false lead is the agenda point I need to win. Unfortunately, it is also the agenda point my opponent needed to win. If my opponent was on 5 points, I would have jammed the false lead in the remote instead. Instead, I went for the hostile takeover just to secure me the 6 points. And then try to find some creative way of winning? I don't know. This is really difficult. We are both stuck at a crossroads. My opponent doesn't have a full rig set up, but on the other hand, I am stuck with a false lead that I can't really score right now. So let's see how this turn goes. This is a very crucial turn. My opponent knows that I'm live. I could very well win next turn, and I know that I need to win ASAP. So my opponent starts setting up with Andysucker. Thinking that there's an archer on the remote, my opponent sets up the sucker so that they can break it with Mimic Sucker. And there you see the Mimic installed. So at this point, Archer becomes dead, but I do not have an Archer on my remote. What I do have is a Chimera that will keep my opponent out if they don't have a decoder. Knowing that the passport's in the bin, I probably can score this false lead. Maybe. What if they have a special order in hand? This is very difficult. This is for the win. What's the right choice here? There are lots of decisions I could make considering I have the Atlas token. Here I decided to use the Atlas token to grab an agenda. Sounds weird. The reasoning behind that is I wanted to reduce agenda density on R&D. This would allow me to score the agenda and not have to worry about Hail Marys on R&D. So I got the Atlas, dropped the false lead in there instead because I was being cheeky, and then take a credit. Hopefully my opponent doesn't have the solution. We'll see. And yeah, my opponent's forced to check it because I'm on match point, so it would be really nice if that was a snare and I can force my opponent to hit it last click. So nope, they did have the special order in hand. Special order for York. York is the other breaker in the deck. You install York, run Archives to get the third sucker counter. That way they can ensure they can break Archer. Or nope, he runs HQ instead. Yep, because obviously HQ is Enigma. And use the last click to run the remote. So there were lots of things I could have done in that situation to win. I could have tilted a snare with the Atlas token instead. That would flatline my opponent. And if they didn't run it, I might have been bluffing with the false lead in my hand anyway. I could have tilted up a power shutdown, which would have slowed down my opponent. There were lots of things I could have done. I could also have installed the false lead a couple turns ago and left the hostile takeover in hand. So there are so many decision points, especially once you have the Atlas token, and I just misplayed it, unfortunately. I could continue rambling on about the ways in which I could have won that game. There's so many lines of play available once you have the Atlas token, and I think this is what makes this matchup pretty classic. The fact that both sides have options available to them if they play it optimally. Having any card in your deck at your disposal as Grindel is really, really cool. Of course, you have to note that you have to be really careful with what the cards that you use, because since you don't have any Jackson or any recursion in your deck, once a card is used, it's gone forever. So yeah, you only have a limited number of each card, but it's almost certainly more than enough. The number of tools in your deck is more than enough for you to close out the game one way or another, be it lockout, or flatline, or scoring to 7. On Andromeda's side, there's equally a lot of things you can do. And one of the very interesting things about this matchup is how Grindel, from the very get-go, has a latent threat to it, which allows Grindel to play fast. You notice that I didn't really need to ice R&D at all. The ice at the end was merely a threat. Wasn't going to do much. And that's quite important because the latent threat of Snare and Seesaws means that Andromeda cannot just run willy-nilly and expect to win off being aggressive as a normal Crim would. Controlled aggression is very necessary, and they have to be careful to not trip up and make silly mistakes that would cost them a game that they otherwise would have won. There are some very important cards that they have in your deck, such as Plascrete, which negates the flatline threat to some extent, as well as Same Old Thing, which is a very flexible card, is the Atlas token of Andromeda. Very interesting matchup, and one which is nail-biting for both sides, should I say. This is one of those rare matchups where the random element of accessing a snare or tutoring the wrong breaker with special order enhances the experience rather than undermines it, because there's always the element of skill and decision involved where players can look back on. And that is pretty good design in my opinion. Hope you enjoyed it. As always, thanks for watching and happy net running. I'll see you next time.